At number 10 is that Kang is a time traveler from the 30th century. This fact is pretty obvious to those who know the character, but it's worth mentioning because it explains a lot about how Kang has gained such an insane power level, and how he's so omnipotent. It might also explain how good Kang is at time travel, having existed in multiple different times throughout history. One of his most notable personas throughout history was Rama-Tut in ancient Egypt, but it doesn't end there. Kang is known to have mastered time travel to such an insane degree that he has appeared in every single century at one point or another. This is part of why he has that suffix on his name, the Conqueror, because his goal is to conquer every era in the history of the world. At number 9 is that his first love, Ravonna, actually sacrificed herself to save him. During the 40th century, Kang meets a rebellion from the people whose kingdom he's conquering at the time, and one of the rebels is Ravonna, a woman that Kang had grown feelings for. But when his commanders urge him to execute her, Kang can't bring himself to do it. This eventually causes an uprising, leading to someone taking a shot at Kang. But Ravonna gets in the way of it, jumping in front of Kang and sacrificing herself to save him. This is one of the few times we see Kang the Conqueror show love for anything other than conquering, and also one of the few times we see his plan fall off the rails to such a detrimental degree. I mean, hey, love is a powerful thing.
Number 8. Dark Web. What is Dark Web? Well, it's the current ongoing Spider-Man event following what happened in Beyond, which we already touched on and which resulted in the creation of Chasm. Ben Reilly now has a new identity and a new purpose. He has been warped by his loss of memories completely, and probably from falling into a bunch of ooze. He decides the best course of action now is to take out those responsible for his fall from grace, and he decides to ally himself with others who have been wronged in order for them to all achieve their own similar but different objectives. Chasm's plan is to defeat Peter Parker, who he sees as a threat, and who he ultimately blames for all the things that have befallen him, basically feeling that like Peter is kind of keeping memories from him, when really that's not what Peter wants to be doing. Dark Web is about these various villains coming together to redeem what they feel they are owed, having all been twisted in some way by past traumas, and for some of them kind of current traumas. Really, it's an event about confronting the pain others have caused you and all the various ways you can deal with, and you can hopefully potentially heal from that. Number 7. Chasm. Why the name Chasm? Does it mean anything to Ben? Why, yes, of course it does. Chasm is a name that Ben chose in reference to the memories that he is missing, because without them there is a great void in his mind. You might say, a great chasm? What memories did Ben lose? Well, chiefly he lost the memories that made him who he was, a hero. He lost the formative memories that he shares with Peter of their childhood, a childhood that Peter actually lived but Ben only remembers. He also lost some of the memories that Beyond wanted him to lose, ideally, which means that he wouldn't have remembered uncovering their secrets. So in that way, it kind of makes sense that when it comes to who he blames for the missing memories and the lack of a sense of self, he would blame Peter for this more than not. Although I do believe at the end of Beyond he does kind of figure out that Beyond was still kind of behind everything, but I do question how much of the memories he has of that are there. There is also the fact that Maxine Danger, head of the division of Beyond that Ben did work for, implied that the only way to get back his memories would basically be to use one of their devices to forcefully take said memories from Peter, pitting the two against one another during the final showdown in that event. Number 6. The Calling. We also learn near the beginning of Dark Web of how Chasm may not have even been the major player behind the plot here. As Chasm, Ben is suffering. He is questioning who he is, and every thought and memory he has left seems to only cause him more suffering, more pain. He has been raiding Beyond safe houses, as we learn in issue number 14 of the Amazing Spider-Man series, and finding all kinds of tech there. And it seems to be one of the only things that brings him any sense of relief. Well, maybe other than Janine's presence, who, you know, she obviously I think makes him feel a little better. The tech he claims feels like some kind of key. He knows that Beyond was using it in some kind of project that was near completion called Project Purgatory, and he believes with his genius he can actually get it to work. And it seems that is the key to the calling he is feeling, reaching out to him from a place. A place called Number 5. Limbo. Chasm isn't just allied with anyone when it comes to this Dark Web event. He's allied with one of the most powerful villains around, one of the most powerful people around, Madeline Pryor. Madeline Pryor more recently seemed to be focused on healing, moving past her traumas, not villainy, but it turns out this was all part of a larger plot to get what she wanted most. Madeline Pryor apparently hadn't actually healed. at least not fully. And what she needed to complete the process, or what she needed because the process hadn't been completed maybe, was the memories that were stolen from her. These were the memories of Nate, aka once baby Christopher, growing up. Jean ended up acquiring all of Madeline's memories following the original Inferno event in the comics when Maddie was defeated. Jean ended up in a way becoming like a mom to Nate because of this, because she had an emotional connection to him with all the memories of raising the baby that Maddie had prior. And now Madeline wants all of that back. Well, she wants the backlog of stuff that she missed. She wanted not just the memories of raising baby Christopher, but also the memories of what happened with raising him after she'd missed out on that. And she also wanted all the memories involving her and her death and her funeral. And this was where her allegiance with Chasm basically came in. Chasm is also after his lost memories, which he feels Peter Parker has stolen from him, and aims to get them back himself and also end Peter Parker in a sort of there can only be one type showdown. Number 4. Hallos Eve. Not only is Madeline an ally of Chasm, but so is Hallos Eve. Hallos Eve is actually Janine Godby, who is Ben's love interest. Kinda like his version of Mary Jane, but if Mary Jane had an even more messed up childhood and was also forced into becoming a murderer and a criminal in self-defense, spending most of her adult life in prison. Hallos Eve ends up becoming a villainous sidekick to Chasm and the Goblin Queen in the Dark Web event after Maddie uses the demonic magic of Limbo to give Hallos Eve powers. Hallos Eve can essentially create masks which have different effects on her enemies depending on which one she's wearing and wielding at the time. The symbolism here is kind of in reference to the fact that in her life, Janine has felt she had to assume many different identities in order to survive, which is why Maddie sort of gave her that power. Even her name, Janine, is actually not her original name, but one she adopted when she was on the run, although it is the name she chooses to be addressed and referred to by in preference to her given name, because obviously she has past stuff attached to that she does not want to think about, I imagine. Number 3. Venom. While not as Chasm specific, I feel like this point is still really relevant when it comes to Chasm and his story in Dark Web. Chasm and the Goblin Queen, along with their sidekick Hallos Eve, aren't the only ones who end up allied together in this event. Venom also gets sucked into this villainous team up himself, which might seem odd initially, considering that Venom is Eddie Brock, who isn't even really Venom anymore, but rather is the King in Black following the defeat of Null. Not only that, but Eddie for the last few years has really been more of a straight up hero, not a villain at all. Venom, the symbiote Venom, would go on to bond with Dylan Brock, Eddie's son, but after Eddie ends up in Limbo requesting help from Madeline and Chasm, Maddie sees an opportunity here. She agrees to help Eddie find his son, but in exchange forces him to join her and Chasm's plot, removing Eddie's memories of Dylan. Now this makes him believe he is Venom once more, but after he realizes his other is no longer there and he's alone, he instead becomes the future villainous version of himself, or one of those, Bedlam. Number 2. Gus. Maybe one of the darkest moments of all comes to us in Amazing Spider-Man issue number 14, at least thus far. In this late 2022 issue, Chasm is revealed to be allied with both the Goblin Queen and Hallos Eve, and ends up confronting someone who repeatedly has mistaken him for Peter, insisting that Ben pay him what Peter owes. Well, before Ben had simply responded that, he was not in fact Peter, so just stop talking to me, I'm not Peter. This time around, Ben instead beats the man up and then takes him to Limbo. There, Madeline Pryor kills the man by consuming his soul, and in so doing receives his memories. This tactic then inspires Chasm when it comes to how to best retrieve his memories from Peter. No longer having the device, I believe, that Maxine offered him before, Ben now plans to kill Peter and consume his soul in order to regain the memories lost to him. Not only is that a super dark and terrifying thought and twist, but we also need to acknowledge here that Ben and Janine both became accessories to murder. Number 1. Pain. As if someone wasn't bad enough, it seems the key to understanding Chasm and so many of the characters' narratives present in Dark Web as well is understanding loss and pain. To really understand why Ben becomes Chasm and why he pursues Peter so ruthlessly, you need to understand what his loss feels like. In issue number 14 of Amazing Spider-Man from 2022, Ben describes his loss to Janine and how it feels to him. I've lost a lifetime. I don't know what I was before I woke up in the Jackal's lab. There's nothing and then I'm just there. And everything after that is scrambled. The only memories that seem to punch through, the ones carrying pain. People telling me I'm not real, beyond manipulating me, all the dying, all the loss. I don't remember meeting you, but I remember all the times I lost you. Pain, pain, pain. It's understandable why he and so many others involved in this story seem to be turning to the darker side, because, I mean, they sound to really be hurting. And isn't that how it usually goes? You get hurt, and you usually end up hurting others. Even if on paper that seems like an obvious thing to not do as someone who's been hurt, it never seems to be quite so obvious to characters, or honestly even real world people in the moment.
Coming in at number 10, One of the First. Although he has been mysteriously absent from any of Spider-Man's movies and most of his video games, fans of the comics know that Craven the Hunter is one of Spider-Man's earliest and most dangerous foes. Created by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, Craven first appeared in The Amazing Spider-Man number 15 in August of 1964, one issue after the debut of the Green Goblin. Craven is Sergei Kravenov, a Russian big game hunter who sets his sights on the biggest game, superhumans, and specifically Spider-Man. In their first encounter, Craven hits Spider-Man with a nerve punch, disabling one of his arms, but even with just one arm, Spider-Man overcame the villain. Upon realizing that he can't win with just his fists, Craven resorted to getting Spider-Man with a poisoned blade, which weakened him. But after that, the two go their separate ways, with Craven coming back every once in a while to give it another good old try and get beaten. Number 9. Inspiration. During his first appearance in comics, Craven refers to his hunt for Spider-Man as, quote, the most dangerous game. This iconic line is a direct reference to a short story from 1924 called The Hounds of Zaroff, also known as The Most Dangerous Game by Richard Connell. The Most Dangerous Game follows General Zaroff, a Russian aristocrat and big game hunter who hunts people as a hobby on his private island. Zaroff is a sadist, like Craven, with a strong sense of honor when it comes to hunting and being hunted, like Craven. It seems obvious that the Spider-Man villain is based on this literary character, but I don't believe that's ever actually been truly confirmed in writing by the creators. Number 8. The Mark of Cain. Like I just said, Cain is also able to stick to virtually any surface and crawl across it just like a Spider-Man can. But for Cain, his mental control over this ability has been increased so far that he can literally rip a wall down just by tugging at it hard enough with his palms. But more so than that, Cain can channel energy endothermically through his hands, creating an intense amount of heat that can leave severe burns on a person or object through skin to surface contact. This is referred to as the Mark of Cain, and it is basically his calling card, with Cain typically leaving the mark across his victim's face. This became a crucial part of some of his stories, being used to identify him as a suspect or even being copied by others to try and frame Cain for crimes he did not commit. On the plus side, the mark allows Cain to easily burn his long hair and beard to a shorter length without burning himself in the process, so free haircuts! Shame about the burning smell of hair though. Don't like that. Number 7. He's a menace! Now, believing Ben was the real Peter Parker and that Peter was his clone brother, Cain was determined to keep Ben away from New York so that his brother could live the life that Cain was denied by the degeneration factor. While tracking Ben Reilly, Cain fell in love with a Salt Lake City police detective, Louise Kennedy, but Cain discovered that she was corrupt and had lied to him. This fact, coupled with his genetic deterioration and the feeling he's been abandoned by his father, Cain went pretty insane and he took Louise down. He then went on to try and torment Ben Reilly, making it appear as though Janine Gobe, the woman Ben had come to love, had taken her own life. Eager to help his fellow clone out, meaning Peter, Cain also committed a series of horrible crimes and had them pinned on Ben Reilly. When Ben returned to New York to visit a sick Aunt May, Cain followed him there too. When he discovered that Ben was in the city, he hounded him to try and prevent Ben from involving himself in Peter's life. Now, because of Cain's enhanced precognitive spider sense, he predicted that someone would try and take out Mary Jane Watson, and to stop this, he went on a massacre, taking out a number of Spider-Man's rogues gallery, including Dr. Octopus and the Grim Hunter. Of course, this kind of backfired a bit, causing Peter Parker to end up in prison since, you know, all of their fingerprints are exactly the same. But Ben Reilly eventually took Peter's place, and there's this really weird mock trial thing that happens. Basically, Cain is a troublemaker is the point I'm trying to make. He does get redeemed though, so that's good. Number 6, passing and returning. Eventually, Peter Parker falsely accepted that he was the clone and Ben was the true Peter Parker, and so he allied himself with the Jackal. But Cain, like some twisted guardian angel, refused to let Peter throw away his life, and he confronted the Jackal, but alas, the Jackal twisted Cain's mind yet again. Cain left, feeling rejected, and went back to Mary Jane, who taught him about all that power and responsibility. So then Cain returned to the Jackal's lab in time to help Ben in a battle against numerous Spider clones. Cain surprisingly saved the Jackal from Spider's side, but was then impaled on a masonry spike, ending his life. But don't worry, for some reason, the Jackal then placed Cain in a regeneration pod, and when that pod was next seen, it was empty. During Ben Reilly's time acting as Spider-Man, an event took place where some of the world's strongest fighters were pitted against one another in a fighting competition called the Great Game, all for the amusement of wealthy people. Ew. One of the game's main sponsors, James Johnsmeyer, found the pod containing the revived Cain and decided to initiate him into the competition. At the end of that story, Cain accepted Ben Reilly as his brother, finally, and turned himself in to the police. Number 5, passing and returning yet again. After the events of Dark Reign, which did include Cain but aren't really that important other than the discovery of Norman Osborn's involvement in the Clone Saga, we got the amazing Grim Hunt story. Cain was attacked by Alyosha and Anna Kravenov for being associated with the Spiders, but since he wasn't a quote true Spider, the villains decided to instead punish Cain by keeping him alive but wounding him severely enough that he fled to Peter Parker's apartment in search of help. Now Peter hid him in the bathroom, then left to stop the Kravenovs. I forgot to mention, for a good chunk of time here, Cain had been sporting long hair and a big old beard, so now when Cain next appeared, he had shaved his face and cut his hair, thank God, and he resembled Peter a lot more closely, which is important because when Spider-Man was quote killed to resurrect Craven the Hunter, it turns out it was actually Cain in disguise, and that he had given his life to save Peter Parker. Cain was buried as a Parker but was later seen rising from the grave with mutated features, with the Jackal saying quote, "Rise, cursed one, rise, tarantula." Turns out that the Jackal decided to turn Cain Parker into a human tarantula-like monster with 6 red eyes and 4 spider legs growing out of his back. It's terrifying. Number 4, Scarlet Spider. The Jackal made Cain, who was Tarantula, the first of his followers during the Spider Island event. It's important to note that Cain wasn't really in control of himself here. In his final confrontation with the original, Spider-Man threw Cain into a tank filled with the Cure, a concentration of the anti-Venom symbiote which was intended to help cure the people of Spider Island. The Cure did more than return Cain from being a monster though. It also stabilized his DNA and finally made him a perfect clone of Peter Parker, similar to Ben Reilly. Now Cain was super important against the Spider Queen, using lethal force to bring her down. Following this, Cain started a trip around the USA, and during his stay in Houston, Texas, he saved a young girl from some pretty utterly horrible people. Now using a scarlet suit similar to Spider-Man's, Cain faced the Salamander and managed to defeat him, being named by him as Arachna Escarlata, or Scarlet Spider in Spanish. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, I really am. When the people at the scene cheered him and told them they needed a hero, Cain's sense of responsibility for the girl he saved led him to stay in Houston as Scarlet Spider, leading him to face off against the Assassin's Guild, the Watchdogs, and Anna Kravenov. Number 3, the Other. Something that has been established more recently in the Spider-Man mythos is that all Spider-Man-like heroes across the multiverse are known as spider totems, meaning they source their spider powers from a powerful spider deity known as the Other. This made them a target for the Inheritors, who feed on the power these totems possess. This led to the passing of Spider-Man at the hands of Morlun. Now, Parker would be resurrected and was chosen as an avatar of the Other, but he would reject this. During a battle against the sick and twisted villain Carlos Lobo and his sister in Houston, Cain found himself in the afterlife yet again. Except when Cain passed away this time, his body became wrapped in a cocoon made of spiderwebs, just like when Spider-Man had passed away. Just like Peter, Cain found himself in a vision talking with the Other, who explained that it was the one who had resurrected Cain after Craven's grim hunt. It offered Cain the chance to embrace its power, granting extra abilities that included retractable stingers and other monstrous enhancements, since Peter had refused. While Cain initially refused the Other's offer as well, not wanting to become another monster greater than the one he already was, he was pressed for time as his friend still needed his help. He therefore had no choice but to willingly embrace the Other, being reborn with powerful augmented abilities and a much more arachnid-like appearance. As the avatar of the Other, Cain became a central figure in number 2, the Spiderverse. Cain, who was now a member of the New Warriors, was attacked by Deimos of the Inheritors, who easily defeated the New Warriors. Pinned down, Cain impaled Deimos with numerous spines, and Deimos recognized him as the current avatar of the Other. Before Deimos could drain Cain, however, Old Man Spider-Man, Spider-Woman, Bullet Point Spider-Man, and Ben Reilly from Earth 95 arrived to save him. With Deimos distracted, Gwen was able to rescue Cain, and they retreated to Earth 13, taking losses on the way. Now Cain, along with Ben Reilly and Jessica Drew, later traveled to another universe from where the cloned bodies that granted the Inheritors immortality came from. At the cost of Ben Reilly's life, Cain managed to shut down the facility, which was run by the Inheritor Genix. Fueled by rage for Reilly's passing, Cain traveled to Earth 001, the home base of the Inheritors, to take revenge on them. Drawing on the full power of the Other, Cain transformed and was actually able to take down the leader of the Inheritors, Solus, something that no one else was able to do. Unfortunately though, Cain was seemingly defeated when Morlun used one of Cain's own spider legs against him. Even though the Spider Army couldn't save Cain, thanks to his involvement, they managed to stop the Inheritors once and for all. After all of the spiders returned to their respective universes, surprising absolutely no one, Cain started emerging from his other form's corpse, resurrecting yet again. He would later be again very instrumental in Superior Spider-Man's Spider Team, who were able to finally defeat the Inheritors once and for all, for actually this time, and destroy the web of life and destiny. But that happens after number 1, the clone conspiracy. After Cain resurrected and lost his connection to the Other, it seemed like Cain had been given a new shot at life again. However, it was quickly noticed that his cellular degradation had returned. Cain was recruited to keep an eye on a Gwen Stacy clone, but she was kidnapped and replaced by Spider-Gwen so that Gwen could keep an eye on the new cloning operation of the Jackal. Yes, that's confusing, I'm sorry. However, when clone Gwen needed medication to stop her carrion virus from activating, Cain was forced to bring her to Spider-Man and his friends at Horizon Lab so they could supply her with some of the pills they were studying there. There, Cain informs them how serious the carrion virus is and how his had been reactivated. The Jackal is accidentally tipped off and sends Electro and Rhino to attack Horizon Labs, where Cain tries his best to fight them off but is ultimately defeated and taken to the secret base of the Jackal. Cain was then studied on by the Jackal's ally, Dr. Octopus, but Spider-Woman managed to break him free once Doc Ock turned against the Jackal. Now, the Jackal revealed himself to be none other than Ben Reilly, who went a little bit cuckoo. He then broadcasted a worldwide frequency that caused all of the new used patients to break down, beginning the outbreak of the carrion virus. Cain tried to fight Ben, but Ben threw him out a window without any webs. Spider-Gwen dove after him and saved him, leaving Spider-Man to stop the virus alone. Spider-Man worked with Anna to reverse the frequency that was accelerating the virus, while Cain and Gwen watched it succeed on the ground. With his world saved from the carrion apocalypse, Cain decided to hunt down Ben Reilly, whose apparent passing at the hands of the outbreak he correctly assumed had been faked. Coming in at number 10, the first clone. The man that would come to be known as Cain Parker was the first ever clone of Peter Parker, created by Professor Miles Warren, aka the Jackal, in his plot for revenge against Peter Parker for his role in the passing of Gwen Stacy. Now, Cain initially appeared to be a perfectly successful clone, but after a short while his body began to break down due to a flaw in the cloning process that left Cain with clone degradation. No longer of use to Warren, the scientists use Cain as a test body. The Jackal also augmented Cain's already formidable powers and then basically completely discarded the clone. The Jackal went on to create another clone, the man who would become Ben Reilly. When the Jackal used Reilly against Peter Parker, the ensuing battle left Reilly and the Jackal for dead, but surprise, they both managed to still survive, with Reilly leaving New York upon realizing that he was simply a clone. Unbeknownst to pretty much anyone, Norman Osborn, that dastardly devil, had managed to have the files on Ben and Peter switched, making it seem as though Peter was the clone and Ben was the real deal. Now, Cain, who broke into the Jackal's lab and took a look at those said files, was led to believe the same thing and followed Ben Reilly, aka the Scarlet Spider, to Salt Lake City in his self-imposed exile. Number 9. Power difference. Now, due to his degeneration, Cain noticed some differences between his powers and Peter Parker's. For starters, he has almost all the same powers as Peter, but they're actually amplified, meaning he's way stronger than Peter is. He has a precognitive sense as an amplified version of the classic spider sense as well. This shows Cain flashes of the future, allowing him to be a step ahead in combat. Cain also possesses an advanced version of Spider-Man's wall crawling ability, which by extension grants Cain a special ability called the Mark of Cain, but we'll talk about that in just a second. Cain is also incredibly adept at hand-to-hand combat, as you'd expect from a Spider-Man clone with precognitive abilities. On top of all that, Cain also possesses a limited healing factor, the ability to produce his own silk webbing, meaning he doesn't need web shooters, a knack for connecting with spiders and other insects, and since he's a clone, he has an immunity to Peter Parker's spider sense.
At number 8 is that Kang will eventually become Immortus. Since Kang sort of exists in every time period all at once, we already know what his future holds. And we've seen that in his future, he will eventually become the Time Lord known as Immortus. Way down the line, it is known that Kang will grow tired of feeling the pain of loss and suffering through his conquest, and he'll decide to reside in the temporal Limbo dimension. Serving as the Timekeeper's avatar, Immortus, Kang settles into a more comfortable life, one that isn't even considered to be villainous in nature anymore. His job becomes to defend timelines from disruptive time travelers like his former self. But literally, his former self. He actually has to deal with himself from the past, teaming up with the Avengers to keep order across many timelines. At number 7, Kang once went by the moniker of the Scarlet Centurion. During the modern era, Kang felt he needed another disguise to try and dethrone the Avengers. So, in order to design a new persona, he looked back on his long history with Dr. Doom, who he first met in ancient Egypt as Pharaoh Rama-Tut, mentioned earlier. Inspired by Dr. Doom's armor, Kang then went on to design his own suit and went by the mantle of Scarlet Centurion. This particular effort doesn't get him very far, but that could be due to the fact that he was facing off against the Avengers. Later, Kang's son Marcus takes up the role of Scarlet Centurion as well, which is just another little tidbit for you. At number 6 is the fact that Kang raised the Apocalypse Twins. This is a good example of how time travel can be a very powerful tool if used the right way. When Kang looked into the future, he saw that Uriel and Elman, aka the Apocalypse Twins, would eventually usurp him and get in the way of his own rule. So he kidnaps them as babies and raises them himself as a preventative measure. Luckily for the universe though, the twins escape Kang's grasp and try to establish their own rule. Later, it's revealed that Kang was also trying to prepare the Apocalypse Twins as weapons to wipe out all of mutant kind, a race of beings that Kang felt also threatened his rule altogether. Luckily, the uncanny Avengers take him out before the better part of this plan could be carried out. At number 5 is that Kang actually wielded the Reality Stone during the Infinity Wars storyline. In this storyline, another villain named Requiem is also trying to get the Infinity Stones to reduce the population by half. But instead of wiping out half of the population, Requiem decides to blend people together during a series of Infinity Warps, as they're called. Luckily, Loki is unaffected by this merge and goes around finding people to unmerge. One of those people is Kamala Kang, a mixture of Kang and Miss Marvel, and when they're split back to their normal selves, Kang the Conqueror takes control of the Reality Stone to go into battle against Devondra, who wielded the Soul Stone at the time. It's a pretty notable moment because Kang's powers are such that you might expect him to already have power comparable to the Reality Stone, so when he gets it, his power gets a massive boost. At number 4 is is when Kang raises Black Bolt's son Ahura to wipe out the Inhumans. Another twisted case of Kang the Conqueror using his time travel to screw up other people's lives. This one is on another level than the previous entry because he actually turns, or tries to turn, son on father, which is pretty deplorable if you ask me. But something you might not expect is that Black Bolt actually sends his son Ahura to the past with Kang in order to save him from the events of Secret Wars. Kang does take Ahura to the past, but instead of protecting him, he trains him to turn against his own people and wipe out the Inhumans in the past. Ahura then grows up to be the new Kang the Conqueror as an adult, and the future Inhumans are then forced to kill him. This is a pretty twisted one, both in the sense that it's unfair to Ahura and Black Bolt and all the Inhumans, but also in the sense that it's just darn confusing. This must be why the MCU chose to avoid time travel, well, up until Endgame, I guess. At number 3 is that Kang the Conqueror appeared in Loki Season 1. This is something that some people may have missed because he goes by a different name in this show. Appearing as He Who Remains, the character is introduced as the ruler of the Time Variance Authority and exists at the very end of time. His job is to watch over any and all time-traveling escapades to keep everything in line. This could be considered as the MCU's version of Immortus, mentioned before in the earlier entry on this list. But speculation aside, this is in fact confirmed to be Kang. And why it's important to note is that Kang is about to become a huge player in the MCU, and this appearance will go down as the very first for this iconic character after we see him in more MCU projects over time. One of those projects is Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, which is confirmed to feature Kang the Conqueror as the main antagonist, and he will of course be played by the same actor as He Who Remains from Loki Season 1, Jonathan Majors. At number 2 is that a younger version of Kang became known as Iron Lad, the teen version of Iron Man. Yes, that's right, in Young Avengers, a past version of Kang appears as a teen Iron Man, and not only that, but he is seminal in the formation of the Young Avengers themselves. This heroic version of the villain has no idea of what he will become, but eventually gets a huge wake-up call when he is confronted by his future self as Kang the Conqueror. In this moment, the future Kang, the one we're most familiar with, returns to the past to inform Iron Lad of who he will become. But this confrontation does not go well, understandably, and Iron Lad actually kills Kang, who's his future self, thus creating a temporal paradox. This sort of screws things up a bit, as time travel typically does, but Iron Lad eventually travels forward in time and continues on his path to becoming Kang the Conqueror, setting the timeline back on track. Finally, at number 1 is that Kang's real name is Nathaniel Richards. Now, you may be scratching your head wondering why on earth I would rank this in the top spot, but the reason is that this suggests that Kang may be a descendant of Reed Richards, aka Mr. Fantastic. Now, this ancestral link hasn't been confirmed, but Kang is typically known as a Fantastic Four villain, so it wouldn't be totally shocking if this were to turn out to be true. And to make things even more bizarre, other writers have explored the idea that Kang may be a descendant of Doctor Doom as well. I'm not sure how he'd be a descendant of both Doctor Doom and Mr. Fantastic, but there is a pretty widely discussed theory that this could be true. But either way, I think the most exciting thing about this fact is that writers are clearly not done with Kang in terms of the comics. The more backstory is added to the character, the more interesting he'll become, and that goes for all comic book characters. My guess is that they'll confirm this theory soon, sometimes between now and when the new Fantastic Four movie comes out, and they'll release it in the comics, and then Kang will be introduced to the MCU fans with more of an integrated backstory than he's ever had. But that's just a theory. We'll have to wait until 2025 to see if that actually happens.
Number 10. Beyond Corporation. What happened to make Ben Reilly become the villainous being known as Chasm? That's a good question. Really, this is all explained in the pages of the Spider-Man Beyond event or storyline, which had a ton of tie-ins as well as extra bonus stories with their Point Bay issues, which occurred in between issues of the main storyline, diving deeper into the intricacies of smaller story points as the story unfolded. The Beyond event was a weekly release, so there was lots to read for those of us who followed along with this event. But overall, I'd say this event was worth all the reading, with lots of fun moments as well as many twists and turns to keep us guessing, as well as keep us eager to turn every single page. One of the highlights for me was definitely the team up between Mary Jane and Black Cat. In the Beyond event, Ben Reilly takes over the mantle of Spider-Man after the Beyond Corporation gains the rights to the Spider-Man name and hires him to be basically their Spider-Man. Peter for a while is in a coma, leaving Ben mostly uncontested for the Spider-Man moniker, except for Miles of course, who is actually served papers and threatened to change his name or deal with being sued. Eventually, it's revealed that Beyond was manipulating Ben's mind, and even that Ben had signed off on this, wanting to forget some less desirable moments in his past. However, after he catches on to their real purpose, a violent mind wipe goes wrong, leaving integral memories of Ben damaged and causing him to forget who he is and kind of have like a bit of an identity crisis. In the end, he chooses to die rather than accept help from Peter and falls into a pit of green ooze as the Beyond Corporation headquarters in New York is destroyed. Or at least, we thought he was dead. And friends, before we move on to our next spot on this list, if you love what we do here on Top 10 Nerd and you love hearing about how some more heroic characters can become evil, we have a Top 10 Evil Alternate Versions playlist for you to check out, where you can learn about all the evil alternates that exist in the multiverse. Number 9. The Ooze. In reality, Ben fell into the pit of ooze and was reborn again, this time with improved oozified powers. These newfound powers give him an enhanced spider sense, which also lashes out at the danger that he senses. He can also hit people with blasts of ooze now too. Ooze-tastic.
Number 8. Powers. What's interesting about Craven is that he was born a regular human. Thanks to a herbal potion that he stole from a witch doctor in Africa and the ingestion of rare tropical toxins, Craven's physicality is enhanced past the point of even someone like Captain America. His aging has also been significantly slowed down, which is why he looks like he's like in his 30s, but he's actually around 70 to 80 years old. Craven can lift approximately 2 tons. He brags about being able to drop a bull elephant with a single punch. He has boosted agility and reflexes, as well as the ability to sprint at 60 miles per hour. He's also far more durable than he looks. Spider-Man has claimed to have needed to punch Craven so hard that it would have staggered the Hulk, and Harry Osborn has said that punching Craven felt like punching elephant's hide. Now, obviously, Craven isn't as strong or as fast as Spider-Man himself, but his physicality combined with his intellect, technical skill as a marksman and hand-to-hand fighter, with a hunter's mentality and a heck of an arsenal, makes Craven the Hunter a villain that not many heroes should take lightly. Number 7. An Avenger? What really threw me for a loop was learning that Craven the Hunter became part of Nick Fury's special operations team called the Avengers, all the way back in 1959. Working with Sabretooth, Namora, Dominic Fortune, and more, the team worked to defeat a mysterious organization that was making use of the bad guys in World War II. What's really interesting about the Avengers 1959 though is that Craven had a relationship with Namor's cousin, Namora. And then on top of that, Sabretooth's comments to Namora fueled an already hostile relationship between those two villains. What's annoying is that it's not specified why Craven and Sabretooth loathe one another so much. It's implied that they previously encountered each other in Africa, and I think we can assume that our big game hunter here had at some point set his sights on the Wolverine villain, but until that story is actually written, we shan't know. Number 6. Craven's Last Hunt. Craven the Hunter's comic book tale seemingly came to an end in one of the most shocking Spider-Man stories ever. Craven's Last Hunt finally sees the Hunter get the drop on Spider-Man, sticking Spidey in the neck with a dart and then burying Spider-Man 6 feet under. Craven actually beat his adversary, which only a handful of villains can actually claim to have accomplished. Thinking Peter Parker is down and out, Craven weirdly starts to take on Spider-Man's costume, or a copy of the Black Spider-Man costume, and he hunts down criminals. In an attempt to prove to himself that he's better than Spider-Man, he defeated Vermin, a villain that Spider-Man couldn't defeat without the help of Captain America. Unfortunately, the whole thing still ends in tragedy for Craven though. Spider-Man digs himself out of his grave, which renders Craven's victory moot, but Craven had also accomplished his main goal by besting Spider-Man. Convincing himself that he has no reason to live anymore, Craven chooses to defeat himself permanently. Number 5. His family. Craven the Hunter isn't the only villain in his very large and prominent family. I am going to mispronounce a lot of the names here. His half-brother Dmitry Smerdyakov, I think, is the Chameleon, a master of disguises famously known for being Spider-Man's first ever adversary in The Amazing Spider-Man #1 back in 1963. The Chameleon would go on to be a major and consistent threat to Spider-Man, and it was actually the Chameleon that motivated Craven to go after Spider-Man in the first place. Outside of his half-brother though, Craven has 7 children following in his footsteps. During Craven the Hunter's 2-decade-long absence from the comic books following his passing, other characters took his place. Many of them were members of his family, including his sons. These include Vladimir Kravinoff and Nedrochi Tannengarten. The most notorious members of his offspring are Alyosha Kravinoff, a mutant who became obsessed with power after experimenting with his father's potions, Anna Kravinoff, an inhuman who became notable for working with the Sinister Syndicate, and maybe the most unique of his children were the Sons of Craven, who were actually clones of the original created by the High Evolutionary. Number 4. Gog. Alongside his many interesting children, Craven also became the adoptive father to a mighty alien named Gog. As a crazed big game hunter, it only makes sense that Craven would go to the Savage Land, where prehistoric animals roamed free. But he went with the single-minded objective of conquering the land. While in the Savage Land, Craven stumbled upon a downed spaceship, and in it, he found Gog while the alien was still young and very little. But surprise, the alien aged up quick and grew even quicker until it towered over Craven himself. Craven and the ginormous alien allied together but were still eventually defeated by the Savage Land's Khazar and Spider-Man. Number 3. Resurrection. Remember how I said Craven defeated himself permanently? Yeah, I was telling a fib. Sure, others from his family took his place in his absence, but in the 2009 storyline, The Gauntlet and the Grim Hunt, the original Craven was resurrected. His family brings him back through an arcane ritual using the blood of Spider-Man, which we will talk about more in a bit. Craven returns as strong as ever and restless as heck. The story sees Craven launching a brutal campaign against the Wall Crawler alongside many of Spider-Man's most powerful villains, and it's one of the coolest Craven-centered stories around. Number 2. Squirrel Girl. Craven the Hunter is an incredibly formidable villain, but unlike a lot of other villains, he is fueled primarily by an incredible strong sense of honor. He is incredibly competitive, and the whole reason he even feuds with Spider-Man is for that very reason. Craven actually respects Spider-Man for all the defeats that the web-slinger has caused him. Because of this sense of honor, it's actually not uncommon to see Craven act as an ally from time to time, and one of the weirdest times that happened was when Craven the Hunter was portrayed as an ally for Doreen Green, Squirrel Girl, in the Unbeatable Squirrel Girl series. In this series, Craven tries to capture Squirrel Girl, but she convinces him otherwise and turns him into an ally, and it's both hilarious, slightly ridiculous, but I kinda love it. Number 1. Only Spider-Man. Craven accomplished his ultimate goal by besting Spider-Man. He put himself to rest because he thought he had nothing left to live for, but his family disagreed. They resurrected Craven with that freaky ritual that I mentioned involving Spider-Man's own blood, and because of that ritual, now only Spider-Man, or a clone of him, can ever permanently end Craven's life. Obviously, Spider-Man refuses to cross that line, and he never really would. So Craven sought out Cain, who was Scarlet Spider at the time and one of Peter's clones. Craven put Cain's friends in danger to try and spur him on into taking out the villain, and while Cain did strike Craven with a blow that stopped his heart, the clone then jumpstart Craven's heart again with his superhuman strength. Craven continued to search for new paths to the pearly gates, and he was unable to find a satisfying answer each and every time. This has brought him into conflict with Black Panther, Storm, Flash Thompson's Venom. He's been struck in the heart twice, but nothing outside of a fatal blow from Spider-Man or one of his clones will keep Craven down for the count.
Number 10. Scarlet Witch's original origins. With the MCU depictions being what many folks think of when they think of Scarlet Witch, with Elizabeth Olsen's time as the character becoming iconic for so many of us, myself as a big Wanda fan included, some might be surprised to learn of the original origin given to the character and her brother Quicksilver in the comics. Initially, Scarlet Witch first appeared alongside her brother in Uncanny X-Men issue number 4. While she wasn't a member of the X-Men herself, she was still a member of a mutant team, just not a heroic one. Scarlet Witch was first introduced as a member of Magneto's villainous team, the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. This was because initially she was believed to be a mutant, and over the years would even be revealed as Magneto's secret daughter, with her twin brother, Quicksilver, also being, of course, his son. However, when Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver were introduced in the Disney and Marvel Cinematic Universe, the MCU, mutants did not yet exist, and so their backstories suits were changed. They were also changed in the comics as well, allowing Marvel to use them in their films, as Fox had rights to the X-Men and mutants at that time. And Fox would go on to introduce their own version of Quicksilver in their films, played by Evan Peters, with Wanda only being alluded to through the appearance of his kid sister in Days of Future Past. There's also, I think, a deleted scene where they mention that he has another sister, which is actually probably Wanda. And friends, before I move on to our next spot on this list, if you love what we do here at Top 10 Nerd, why not show us you love us by clicking that subscribe button? You know, hang out, come back when we have other new content. Number 9. Doom Patrol. Some believe that the X-Men is literally a copy of the Doom Patrol. While we don't necessarily have concrete proof of this, DC's Doom Patrol and Marvel's X-Men do share a lot in common, admittedly, including the time that they were both released around. Marvel's X-Men first appeared in their own series in September of 1963, whereas DC's Doom Patrol first appeared in My Greatest Adventure in issue number 80 in June 1963. June, so a few months before. Both teams had older gentlemen guiding a group of eccentric youngsters with fascinating powers. Both of those mentors were also bound to wheelchairs. For DC, it was Niall Calder, known as the Chief. For Marvel, it was Charles Xavier, aka Professor X. Some believe the fact that both were released so close together means that it would be impossible for Marvel to have copied DC, because they would have already been working on that book at the time. But at the same time, the Marvel method, known for speeding up production times, may have made this actually possible. Add in the fact that much of what Marvel made was inspired by DC's works and characters and vice versa, and there were a lot of creatives moving back and forth between the two areas, and it goes from seeming somewhat unlikely to definitely a possibility, at least. Number 8 has a son. I didn't even know this about Miguel, and I actually learned about it while doing research for this list, so hey, I learned something too here. Miguel actually has a son in the comics, so it's not just in the animated universe that he has played the role of father. In the comics, his son is Gabriel O'Hara, nicknamed Gabri. Gabri is the son of both Miguel's Spider-Man 2099 and another sometimes superpowered individual, Tempest. Tempest Monroe was turned into an insectoid monster a few times in the comics, both times when she was being cured, actually. This first happened when Miguel secretly administered a cure for cancer from the year 2099 to her. The second time this happened was when Miguel's father, Tyler Stone, attempted to cure damage to Tempest's spine, which had left her paralyzed. Number 7 died. Miguel O'Hara has come face to face with death a few times, but he pretty much always survived. At one point he was killed in the comics, but thankfully was able to be resurrected afterwards. This happened as a result of a fight with Tempest, his baby mama. However, this isn't because she actually wanted to hurt him, but because she was being mind controlled into doing so by Miguel's biological father, the evil Tyler Stone. I know! What a dramatic turn of events. Fortunately, in the same issue that he died, 2015's Spider-Man 2099, issue number 25, he is also brought back to life by 2099's Doctor Strange. In fact, the whole reason he's able to even go and save Tempest in the first place, when he ultimately dies from her being brainwashed and lashing out as he rescues her, is because a future version of his son, Gabri, let him know where to go. If that isn't a 2099 storyline, I don't know what it is. Your kid from the future telling you. While Miguel never becomes the CEO of Alchemax, despite his troubled past involving them, he does actually end up following in his father's footsteps, kinda. His father was not the CEO either, but instead was the head of their research and development department, as well as the vice president of the company. When Tyler actually went to work for 2099's Doom, or one of them anyways, who became the president of the United States, he named Miguel as his successor. Miguel took control over the department, and later when Tyler returned attempting to get his job back, Miguel actually refused to give it over, which honestly fair enough. Number 5. His brother is Venom. Well, his half-brother, anyways, on his dad's side. Craven Stone is actually Miguel's brother through his father, Tyler Stone. The two brothers never really got along, and Craven actually was completely unaware that Miguel was his brother. Craven in this timeline is the one behind having Punisher 2099, Jake Gallo's family killed. As payback, the Punisher pays him a visit and leaves him to die in the sewers, which is where he is left to bleed out. However, just as it seems that Craven is done for, and honestly, I gotta say, kinda good riddance, he bonds with a black ball of goo that turns out to be the Venom symbiote, who after all these years has continued to mutate and change, surviving. Craven becomes the original 2099 Venom and fights against Miguel, becoming his rival and yearning to cause him pain. In fact, Craven even succeeds in hurting Miguel when he kills Dana, Miguel's ex, who was once his fiancée. Number 4. Powers and abilities. While not as strong as fast or as intelligent as Peter Parker's Spider-Man, Miguel O'Hara still has some very impressive powers. His powers come from his DNA being rewritten to basically 50% spider. In fact, exactly 50% spider, I should say. This also changed his appearance, giving him fangs and making his eyes turn red. Hence why in Across the Spider-Verse they call him, sort of that like vampire Spider-Man. Although there are also some other famous vampires in the Spider-Verse that I'm thinking we may still see as well, but we'll have to wait and find out. Spider-Man 2099 possesses superhuman levels of strength, endurance, agility, reflexes, speed, and durability. He also has a pretty potent healing factor, allowing him to heal from cuts within minutes. His healing factor is also believed to affect aging, slowing it. He possesses talons along with his fangs, night vision, enhanced eyesight, and organic webbing. Oh, and he may actually be telepathic to a degree. As I said before, he's also a genius, specializing in genetics, but also having some pretty fierce computer skills. Number 3. First appearance. For those who are curious with where to start when it comes to Miguel O'Hara and his story, we first got a glimpse of him in a preview in Amazing Spider-Man issue number 365, which was also a supersized 30th anniversary issue for Spider-Man. This was where he first appeared, but he wouldn't be properly introduced until a few months later in his own series, Spider-Man 2099 issue number 1, which I believe is what the preview in the 30th anniversary was basically for. Spider-Man 2099 was actually the first comic to start off the 2099 line and universe, so Miguel was actually the first hero we'd come to know from 2099 as well. The first issue establishes Miguel as a brilliant but kind of cruel person whose desperation leads him to become a superpowered vigilante. I gotta say, I really love the art and the colors in this book. 2099 is such like a cool world, like really, it just visually is so striking. Number 2. Lyla. For those who didn't notice, Miguel actually has his own AI assistant. Her name is Lyla, which actually stands for Lyrate Lifeform Approximation. LYL. In the comics, Lyla has a very different look than the animated universe. She kind of reminds me a bit of Marilyn Monroe in the comics, honestly. She also often expresses concern for Miguel, often giving him advice as though she was his friend, as opposed to her being his assistant. Although she does still call him boss like her animated Spiderverse counterpart in the films. As an AI, there is a lot that Lyla can do, but she also seems to be prone to catching human emotions sometimes as well, which is interesting for an AI. However, this was also likely a one-time thing, as it was later revealed that she had become susceptible to a virus after plugging herself into sort of like a worldwide news network and shutting down after being overwhelmed with basically too much emotion. Which honestly, I get it, Lyla. I try to not listen too much to the news because I also get overwhelmed with too much human emotion. Number 1. Future problems. Miguel hasn't always existed just in the 2099 universe of Earth 928, which is believed to be a potential future for Earth 616. At one point, he actually found a home in the main continuity, a version of his past. During his time on Earth 616, his apartment number was funnily enough 2099. Cool on paper, but maybe not so great if anyone is, close to figuring out your secret identity as Spider-Man 2099. Just because he's from the future as well doesn't mean that he doesn't worry about it while living in what we would refer to as the Marvel present day. While time displaced, he also worried about the same issues we all do, such as climate change, heating up the Earth, and threatening our future on the planet, politics, and well, romantic relationships, which honestly sounds like our everyday life here in 2023. For a man from the future, it sounds like Miguel can be fairly good at living in the present. Number 10. Fast food almost ruined 90s X-Men. What even is the title of this point? Well, it was the best way I could put it. It was revealed a while back that the 90s animated X-Men series that we all grew up knowing and loving, personally for me this was my buy-in to the X-Men and much of Marvel's superhero world, was almost cancelled because of an Australian fast food chain. No, I'm not joking. Apparently, Marvel had negotiated a deal with them to do giveaways of toys for the X-Men series, but the contract also cemented that the toys would then have to appear in the show. However, the designs for these toys apparently were pretty terrible. Artist and producer Will Mineo told Marvel he would not put them in the show. As a result, he and the production company behind the show, Graz, almost lost their control over the series. So, we could have had a totally different series, or maybe not one at all, who knows what could have happened. And friends, before we move on to our next spot on this list, if you love when I talk about mutants, I know I love when I talk about mutants, be sure to go check out our X-Men playlist where we all talk about mutants all the time, because that's all that's on the playlist. Number 9. Beast wasn't always blue. Beast might be iconic because of his appearance in the film adaptations, but did you know that him being a blue beast isn't even his main mutation in the comics? And that he didn't always look like this in terms of his X-Men comic book origin. In the prequel films, the serum Nicholas Hoult as Hank takes is intended to be a cure for physical mutations, but this also ends up backfiring when the cure actually kind of intensifies his mutation, making it a lot worse. And because he used some of Mystique's blood, it turns him into a beast with blue fur, because Mystique is blue. You see? In the comics though, Beast's initial mutation is that he just has big hands, big feet, and he's super dexterous and nimble. Kinda similar to what they did in the movies, but a little bit different. Basically, he's kinda like a monkey. Then, as a scientist, he isolates the hormone that causes mutation, which he is then forced to take himself to protect the formula from those who basically want to steal it. This causes him to become a gray or black furred beast, which would later be changed to blue just because of how blacks were basically colored back then. It caused confusion, and then we got Blue Beast. Hank misses his window to use the antidote for this serum though, and then is unable to revert this secondary mutation, with it becoming permanent instead. Number 8. First female Captain Marvel wasn't Carol. Fans of Monica Rambeau in the MCU, who is played by Teyonah Parris, may not know that when it comes to Captain Marvel, she actually held the title before Carol Danvers did. Yep, back in the day, Carol was known as Miss Marvel. With Carol already having a title that was inspired by her role model, the Kree hero Captain Marvel, Monica ended taking up that name for herself. She only kept it for a little while though, as then Miguels Son showed up and wanted to use it, with her taking the name of Photon afterwards. Then moving on to my least favorite of her codenames, Pulsar, before settling on Spectrum back in 2013 in the comics. And she's been Spectrum pretty much ever since, though honestly I still really love the name Photon for her. Monica initially took the name of Captain Marvel back in the early 80s, and Carol actually wouldn't use that name until 2012. Also, if you're wondering why this is an Avengers fact, in case you didn't already know, Monica Rambeau actually is part of the Avengers in the comics.
Number 7. Daredevil Delay. If not for a delay in sending Daredevil #1 to the printer, the Avengers might never have existed. According to Marvel's Senior Vice President of Publishing, Tom Brevoort, when the publisher realized that the first issue of Daredevil wasn't going to be ready in time for its scheduled print run, a mild panic set in, and Stan Lee proposed the idea of bringing a bunch of existing Marvel characters together to form a team similar to something like DC's Justice League of America. Since the characters are all established already, putting them into a team would get rid of the need to create complicated origin stories for the individual members, and the team could just jump right into whatever conflict the creators could come up with on short notice, which happened to be facing the trickster god Loki. The pair brainstormed for a while and came up with the Avengers, and then hastily put together the first issue and sent it off to the printer, and boom! The Avengers were born, with the Wasp coming up with their name. And then... Speaking of the Wasp, what a good lead in. I love that. Number 6. The Wasp led the team. Speaking of the Wasp, thank you for that lead in, Adam. That was so good. Did you plan that? I did.
Oh my gosh, so good. Although Janet Van Dyne hasn't been on the front lines lately when it comes to the Avengers team, did you know that she was not only one of the founding members of that team, but even their leader for a time? It's true. Honestly, I'd kind of love it if they brought back Jan to lead the team in some capacity. I feel like she just hasn't been doing that much of late, outside, sharing a miniseries with her adopted stepdaughter, who's also now the Wasp as well, Nadia. I heard that series was actually really great, by the way. I still need to read it. However, I feel like we could definitely use a return to the time when Janet was more well known and more prominent in the comics. Janet led the team for just over 60 issues, from issue 217 to issue 278 throughout the 1980s. Following her time as a leader, she left to join the West Coast Avengers for a while, becoming a permanent member of that team for a time. Also, what is it with the 1980s right now and Marvel Comics? I feel like I'm kind of obsessed with that era.
I feel like I always go through phases where I focus on specific eras. Yeah. Number 5. Blueberry? The MCU's Iron Man is known for his confidence, heroic tendencies, inventions, jokes, and just being the guy who started it all, really. But another defining characteristic of Robert Downey Jr.'s Tony Stark portrayal is how much he eats. Like, he is pretty much always eating. Some of Iron Man's most memorable moments in the MCU involve him eating food, but that wasn't planned. It ain't in the script. Tony's eating habits developed during the movies as a result of Robert Downey Jr. being hungry. Robert often brings his own food to set and hides it all so that he can eat during different scenes. This is kind of done out of necessity, as the demands of being a leading man often mean a grueling work schedule without major breaks. So instead of skipping meals or not eating all day, Downey often just eats during his scenes, which meant having Iron Man always eating in the MCU. That's why in the first Avengers movie, everyone remembers him walking around antagonizing Cap and making nice with Banner while wielding a shiny bag of blueberries, offering them to those who agree with him and denying them from those who opposed him with pretty great effectiveness.
Number 4. The most fantastic members. If you've ever wondered how separate the Avengers and the Fantastic Four are kept in the comics, the answer is, well, fairly separate, usually. While the FF are good friends with many of the Avengers team members and vice versa, they usually stick to fighting their own villains in their own comics. However, there was a time around issue 307 where the Fantastic Four in the late 80s, to the 80s, here we go, when Sue and Reed decided to leave the team for a period. And they would be absent for almost 20 issues on that team. Now, where did they go? Well, for a few issues, they were actually members of the Avengers. However, their time on the Avengers team was even more short-lived than their absence from the Fantastic Four comic. They were members from issue number 300 of the Avengers to issue number 303, which is when they left that team. They would return temporarily along with other heroes who had been members in issue number 305, but that was pretty much it at the time for their Avengers run.
Number 3. First name Agent. Agent Phil Coulson, member of S.H.I.E.L.D., is one of a couple of characters that is pretty unique in comicdom, and that's because he was introduced for the first time in a movie only to end up as a recurring character in the comics afterwards. Specifically, the very first Iron Man movie, the birth of the MCU. The only other character in the last 20 years that has made this big of an impression on the comic community is Harley Quinn, originally introduced in Batman the Animated Series. Since his appearance in the 2008 film, Agent Coulson has appeared in the Iron Man 2 webcomic titled Phil Coulson, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., along with a new comic titled Battle Scars in 2011, and he's gone on to appear more and more. Although he seemed to pass away in Avengers at the hands of Loki, he had actually only passed for about 8 seconds before being revived, and he went on to actually do quite a bit, particularly in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. In the 616 comic continuity though, he has had parts to play in Civil War 2 and Secret Empire alongside Deadpool, and then what's really crazy is that he went on to the point of no longer wanting an Avengers team, and he even sold his soul to Mephisto and warped reality to do it. But then Blade formed another group of Avengers and Coulson got trapped inside a Pandemonium cube. Never expected that from Phil. Gonna be honest.
Number 2. They're eternal. At the time that the Fantastic Four were briefly members of the Avengers, there were also some other folks you might recognize joining up with the team. You may or may not recognize them actually, as they aren't known for being the most popular group around, but I gotta be real with you, their latest series by Kieran Gillen was one of the best things happening in comics that I've read in the last few years. And if you've seen a certain movie that also released pretty recently within the last few years, you might know who I'm talking about here. Goodness, that comic book series, by the way, was so good, you should read it. We're talking about the Eternals. Not all of the Eternals have been members of the team, and they definitely aren't as iconic of members as the mainstays like Captain America and Iron Man, but I do enjoy the relationship the Eternals have with the Avengers, with some of them being former members. It strengthens their ally bonds, but it's also cool to think about just how much power Eternals like Cersei and Gilgamesh brought to their team during their time on it. Oh, and Star Fox, aka Eros, Thanos' brother, who is technically the first Eternal to join the Avengers, although not the first Eternal from Earth to join, rather the first Eternal from the planet Titan to join, because that's where he's from. There's Eternals everywhere.
Number 1. Avengers 1 million BC. Over 1 million years ago, the early human mutant known as Firehair became the avatar of the Phoenix Force and nearly destroyed the planet. Realizing that that's pretty bad and that she wasn't the only one capable of doing that, she began assembling a team of supernatural and mystical beings to protect humanity and Earth. The eventual team was made up of the Asgardian god Odin Borson, the demigod sorcerer Agamotto, the Black Panther of the Panther Tribe, the woolly mammoth riding Ghost Rider, which is so awesome, Iron Fist Fan Fei, and a super smart caveman who wielded the Star Brand, which made him look surprisingly like the Hulk. After fighting some corrupted Celestials as well as time-traveling villains from the present like Thanos, multiple Doctor Dooms, and Mephisto, the team eventually disbanded, and it was all because Odin really does not respect women. That's pretty much how it goes. After the passing of the team's Black Panther, Odin attempted to make advances on Phoenix only to be totally rejected for his lack of respect. After she went to visit the Panther tribe, her and the rest of the Avengers were summoned to Asgard. When they showed up, Odin had called them for an unannounced surprise wedding between him and Phoenix that was taking place right that second. Understandably disgusted, Phoenix left Asgard and Earth, intending never to return. The whole thing fractured the team and they only reunited one time to witness the birth of Thor.
Number 10. Nick Fury's casting in the films. One of the most interesting facts for me when it comes to the Avengers in regards to the films is the fact that Samuel L. Jackson was actually cast as part of a deal he made with Marvel in regards to them using his likeness in their Ultimate line without actually first asking him. That's right, they borrowed Jackson's likeness for their Ultimate version of Nick Fury of Earth 1610. This version of Fury actually became so popular that he was later incorporated into the main comic book line, with Earth 616 getting Nick Fury Jr., who looks quite similar to the Ultimate version of the character. When Samuel L. Jackson found out about Marvel using his likeness for Nick Fury, he got in contact and basically made a deal with them that he would get to portray the character on the big screen when that day came. And that's exactly what happened, with Nick Fury being the one responsible for bringing the team together in the cinematic universe.
Number 9. Avengers Mountain. It's really sneaky of the Avengers to call their new HQ Avengers Mountain, because that thing ain't a mountain at all. It's a 2,000 foot tall corpse of a space god called the Celestial. Specifically, this Celestial is known as the Progenitor, and it came to Earth 4 billion years ago. They took that sucker's body and converted it into their home base with living quarters for each member of the team, a gym, a laboratory, and docks for ships. It's creepy as hell, and just to prove that point, they connected every quote floor in the quote building by turning the Celestial's spine into the quote spinal lift. How messed up is that? The Avengers partially reanimated the Progenitor's circulatory system and used the cosmic energy from its blood cells to turn one of the ventricles of its heart into a teleportation hub. They turned the Celestial's cerebrum into a server room called the Brain Room, with the most powerful computer terminal in the galaxy. Each finger of the Progenitor's right hand was turned into a personalized hanger. As some kind of weird sick joke, its left bicep got turned into the Avengers Strength and Conditioning Center, and its quote mustache area was turned into Tony Stark's locker room. They even turned the space god's intestinal tract into a detentional facility for captured villains. Not going to lie though, it's actually kinda cool. Nowhere is a celestial head, so it's not like this is anything new.
Number 8. Scarlet Witch has never joined. Surprisingly, despite being first established as a mutant and Magneto's daughter, Scarlet Witch herself has never served on the X-Men team, or any X-Men adjacent team for that matter. The only mutant-based team she was ever a part of was the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. After moving from reluctant villain to hero, Wanda instead joined up with the Avengers, also alongside her brother Quicksilver, who has also been a member of the Avengers team. While Quicksilver was never an X-Men team member either in the comics, he has been a member of a few different iterations of X-Factor. And in the X-Men films, he was granted membership to the mainstay team of X-Men, and is actually probably one of the most powerful members of that team, in my opinion. Number 7. Professor X is a creep. Don't believe me? Just go back and read or reread issue number 1 of X-Men. Yeah, while a lot of people might cite later issues from the Joss Whedon days of X-Men where Professor X's creepiness and darkness was really brought to light, I say this sense with Professor X, for me, actually started way back, as early as that issue number 1. What triggered the sense of ick? Professor X crushing on one of his own students, Jean Grey. Well, I know that initially the X-Men youngsters were intended to be somewhat older in that original run, and that this was a different time period entirely, where a teacher or mentor falling in love with their student wouldn't have been as icky or as frowned upon. Knowing what I know of Jean and Charles now, in the present day, it feels pretty creepy to me. And before you bring up the fact that Wolverine is considerably older than Jean, and they obviously get shipped together a ton, this also has a lot more to do with Professor X knowing Jean since she was an actual child, and their firmly established teacher-pupil relationship, which is not something that Jean and Wolverine have, and he also didn't literally know her when she was a kid. At least not as far as I know. Has that happened? If it has, let me know. That would also be creepy though. Number 6. X-Factor. While today X-Factor has become more well known as being a mutant detective agency, this isn't actually how they started out at all. After the original team of X-Men had shifted in the 80s and 90s, introducing us to an all-new lineup, Marvel decided they also wanted to pay homage to the original roster by bringing the team back together. The problem was, they already had a popular X-Men team that had different yet extremely popular mutants as members. So instead of changing the roster, they simply introduced a secondary everyone. To avoid confusion, this team would be known as X Factor, which was basically just the original X-Men team returned, featuring Cyclops, Marvel Girl, Beast, Angel, and Iceman. It wasn't until much later that the X Factor team would turn from simply OG X-Men to a detective agency with an entirely new roster of mutants. X Factor initially was a government-funded team whose front was acting as mutant hunters, when in reality they would actually be tracking down new mutants, which they would then take in and train, because they themselves were mutants. But you know, shh, don't tell the government. Ooh. Number 5. Miss Marvel's secret origins. Did you know that Miss Marvel's Kamala Khan was initially designed to be a mutant? It's true. While she has never been a member of the X-Men prior to now, she was recently killed in the comics and resurrected so she could get the origin that her creators originally intended her to have. So I'm sure when people were like, wait a minute, but isn't she supposed to be an Inhuman? She was, but that was actually, they didn't even want that to be the thing. And they also probably changed it in the comics so that her origin can match up with her MCU counterpart's origin. In case you missed it, in the Miss Marvel Disney Plus streaming series, it was suggested at the end that Kamala was likely a mutant, which is in part where her powers and abilities come from. And a lot of people were upset about that, but really that was the intention of the creators at the time, so it wasn't them changing it in the MCU, it was actually them going back to what they originally wanted for her in the comics, but then they had to make her an Inhuman. At the time of her creation in the comics, Marvel was trying to focus more on the Inhumans and promoting them, as they didn't really have the rights to the X-Men. In order to maximize profits, they decided to promote the Inhumans, trying to make them as big as the X-Men were, while downplaying the X-Men team and mutants at that time. So although her creators, Sana Amnat, Stephen Wacker, G. Willow Winson, Jamie McKelvey, and Adrian Alphona wanted her to be a mutant, instead Marvel made her an Inhuman with the Terrigen Mists that were released on Earth, which activated her abilities. But not anymore. Now she's a mutant. Number 4. First X-Men script. While the first X-Men film wouldn't end up being released until 2000, did you know that there was a film in the works since as early as the 1980s? And guess who wrote the script? None other than comic book legends Jerry Conway and Roy Thomas. Supposedly, the film would have seen some of the most famous mutants of the day take on an evil organization known as Proteus. The X-Men team would have been led by Professor X before the incident that resulted in him losing the use of his legs. It also would have featured Cyclops, Wolverine, Storm, Kitty Pryde, Nightcrawler, and Colossus on the team. Interesting. Kinda wanna read that script. Number 3. The first mutants. Do you know who the first real mutants are? Now, we're not talking about Namor the Submariner, first mutant to appear in Marvel Comics. Instead, we're going back in Marvel continuity history about 2 billion years ago into the past to the ancient mutant civilization of Threshold. In the beginning of the second volume of Marauders, we actually find out that the mutants of Threshold, known as the Enriched, were the first mutants. Even more intriguing, one of the lone survivors of the civilization was Okara, who would go on to become the ancient sentient mutant island known throughout mutant history. Number 2. Living Island. The island that the mutants currently live on, in fact, is Okara, or rather, a part of Okara. Okara actually split in twain later on to become 2 separate entities, Krakoa and Arakko. Krakoa ended up on Earth, while Arakko for a long while was confined to Otherworld, overrun by the demons of Amenth, while the mutants of Arakko tried to basically defend their land. That's right, it's not just an island in itself, but it's also literally a mutant. Well, a sentient mutant island, I guess. When establishing Krakoa, Professor X and Magneto recruited the help of Cypher, who was able to scout ahead to use his powers to communicate with Krakoa and see if they could come to some agreement in regards to the island becoming the home for the mutant nation that they were seeking to establish. Now, the talks were successful and the mutant nation of Krakoa was born, which is how we have it today. Number 1. Kevin Feige's secret cameo. While Kevin Feige might be best known now as the head of Marvel Studios, this wasn't always his role when it came to Marvel Productions. Back when the X-Men films were really all we had for Marvel movies, before the days of the MCU, go back in time with me, Kevin Feige was actually an associate producer on X-Men. He even agreed to make a cameo in the film, so long as he was completely covered up. He didn't want anyone to know it was him. Because of this, he might be kinda hard to spot, but Feige described his background role as a Weapon X tech guy pulling Wolverine's claws out of the oven. So if you look out for that guy, you might just see him. I mean, you won't see him because he'll be completely covered, but that's him. Number 10. Kind of the worst. Even in the comics, Miguel doesn't necessarily have a history of being the kindest soul around. In fact, before he became Spider-Man, he was actually one of the worst people. Even Miguel himself knows this and has stated before as much, acknowledging that he used to be a huge jerk and now tries to take action to make up for his misdeeds in the past. Initially, Miguel was someone who really only cared about himself and his own interests, until he realized that this was not only not getting him to where he wanted to be, but also causing undue hurt to the people and the world around him. Miguel also at one point stole his brother Gabriel's girlfriend. Dana basically became Miguel's fiance after she cheated on Gabriel with Miguel, and she and Miguel fell in love, which is, I feel like speaks to Miguel's character at the beginning of his story. And friends, before we move on to our next point here, if you love what we do here at Top 10 Nerd, be sure to let us know by clicking that subscribe button. Number 9. Villain Origin. Miguel O'Hara was a genius working for Alchemax in genetics. He was pressured into experimenting on people in an attempt to, in essence, recreate superpowered individuals. When the experiment went awry, however, he tried to get out and was blackmailed into staying with the company. But Miguel didn't like how he was being controlled and would go to any lengths to free himself, including experimenting on himself. Miguel in this way has a bit of a supervillain tinge to his origin story, if you ask me. Most villains start off kind of in this manner, experimenting on themselves because they're desperate, sometimes to help themselves and sometimes to help others. In Miguel's case, it was to help himself. But while the experiment was sabotaged by his supervisor, it did still work, ultimately curing him of his compulsions, which were sort of keeping him tethered to the company, while also splicing his DNA with the spider and granting him superhuman abilities and powers. Number 8. Animated Beast appeared in live action. I just found this one out today, so I thought I would share it with you all. Did you know that the actor who voiced Beast played a truck driver in the bar where Wolverine meets Rogue in the first X-Men film? It's true! George Buza is the voice of Beast in the animated series, and he appears in this iconic scene. Also friends, I need to go back and watch the X-Men films. What is happening with this bar and the lighting in this scene? Why does it give me abandoned warehouse vibes? Was that intentional? Was that just how films were in the early 2000s and late 90s? I guess kind of, actually, stylistically. Number 7. Not very popular. While we typically celebrate the X-Men as one of the most popular hero groups of all time, I even said it in my intro, not everyone is actually a fan of them. In fact, in the comics, many people don't even like them. Despite being a superhero team, they have dealt with persecution from day one and still do even today, even in 2023. Even other heroes who they might call allies or friends at times have seemingly been absent when the mutants were being hunted or persecuted by others just for existing. So while here, in our reality, the X-Men are, the best, just know that in the comics, there are many on Earth who actually consider them more of a nuisance than J. Jonah Jameson considers Spider-Man a menace. That being said, JJ himself is actually oddly a supporter of mutants. He's a big supporter of just like civil rights in general. So while he might hate Spider-Man and many others on Earth are critical, jealous, or even just hate mutants, JJ himself actually fights for their rights, even at the risk of making himself and the Daily Bugle a target of the many mutant hate groups out there. And trust me, there's a lot. Number 6. New Mutants. You may have heard about the New Mutants. They had a film and everything. Oh, sure, it wasn't like the greatest film out there, and sure, Disney seemed to kind of want to bury said film after their merger with Fox, with New Mutants being the last film under the Fox X-Men franchise umbrella, but it happened, and there was actually quite a few things I actually liked about that film. The New Mutants in the comics basically took over the role of what the original X-Men had been like. Initially, the X-Men were just a group of teens trying to figure out their powers while fighting baddies, and the New Mutants were basically like the fresh blood for the superhero mutants, the new younger recruits coming in after the original X-Men had basically like grown up. Well, that was back in like the 80s, and now it's 2023, so the New Mutants aren't quite so new or young anymore. They themselves have grown up, which allowed us to pave the way for the New Mutants. As such, the recent New Mutants series focused instead on the older classic New Mutants who operated both internationally and intergalactically, and then the younger New Mutants who basically stayed based on Krakoa. So now we actually have a new group of New Mutants, but we also have the old New Mutants as well. Are you confused yet? Number 5. The New Marauders. I love this team. Hands down one of my favorite new teams we've gotten and my favorite mutant team ever, maybe? I mean, I love the X-Men, they are classic, but this spin-off team is just honestly something else. Also, what a powerful team, especially that initial roster. Led by the formerly known Kitty Pryde, who now prefers to simply go by Kate, the new Marauders team is one that instead of harming other mutants, focuses on saving them. That's right, they took the name and they reclaimed it for good. The Marauders were actually once Mr. Sinister's band of goons who did his bidding and were involved in the mutant massacre, but instead, here they are, led by Kate Pryde, initially sailing around the world to rescue mutants being held prisoner by their own nations so they can safely bring them home to Krakoa, and now they've actually gone intergalactic, sailing through space and fighting aliens to do basically just that. Number 4. The Limbo Embassy. Dark Web was a weird time, and to really highlight how weird that event was, I have an update for you. So, Madeline Pryor, the Goblin Queen, one of my favorite tragic mutant characters and X-Men villains of all time, recently turned over a new leaf. During Dark Web, she wanted Jean's memories of her son, baby Christopher, aka Nathan Christopher Summers, aka Cable as most people know him, as she felt she had missed out on his upbringing, which honestly she did, so I understand why she'd want that. What did she do to get these memories? Well, she ended up taking over Limbo from Magic under apparently the guise of being good, though in the New Mutant series this actually seems to have been written more as a genuine turning point for Maddie, but never mind. And then once again, she unleashed a demon army on New York, because it worked so well the last time, Maddie. In the end, Jean gave her the memories she wanted without hassle willingly, turning Maddie firmly to the good side with her becoming the ally of the X-Men. Because, you know, she was like, oh, you just would have just given them to me and I could have just asked you and actually you helped me to get resurrected. Oh, okay. Maybe we should just be friends. And in the aftermath of Dark Web, we were left with a weird gift to New York from Maddie's Limbo, the Limbo Embassy, which also happens to be where Ben Reilly's villainous Chasm is being held prisoner after he and Janine as Hallos Eve attempted to usurp Madeline as ruler of Limbo. Yeah, that's a weird thing. That's gotta be a weird thing on like the New York landscape, you know? It's just a big demon tower. Like, wow, alright. Number 3. Magneto once led the team. Or rather, ran the school and led a team. When Professor X went to space to go be with his Shi'ar waifu, Lilandra, Empress of the Shi'ar, who had space medical treatments that Professor X needed to live at the time, Magneto took over for him. While many people think of Magneto as a straight-up X-Men villain who is sometimes an ally of Professor X's because of their long-standing history in the films, in the comics he's not only been an ally, but he's also at this point been an anti-hero, straight-up hero, and even team leader on the side of good. In fact, if you saw the Magneto miniseries that was announced and is expected to release in August, this is actually a retrospective series that takes us back to his time as headmaster of the school and leader of the New Mutants team, which I think is pretty cool. I don't think a lot of people know this about Magneto. Number 2. Almost cancelled. If you can believe it, as popular as the X-Men are now, this wasn't always the case. In fact, there was even a time when the X-Men comics were cancelled, with almost no possibility of a return in sight. It wasn't until the days of Chris Claremont that the X-Men would truly be cemented as a Marvel staple. Sure, Jack Kirby and Stan Lee started the X-Men off, but there were multiple instances during those days where X-Men actually wasn't doing well and then ended up being cancelled, and people didn't even know when or if it would actually come back. Honestly, people probably didn't even care back in the day because no one really liked the series that much. However, Marvel actually never gave up on the team, and despite the series being cancelled in 1970, after 66 issues, they did their best for 5 years to feature the X-Men anywhere they could in their other books, with the hope of seeing the team return one day. And guess what? It worked. It wouldn't be until the summer of 1975's giant-sized X-Men #1, but they would return with a new story written by Len Wein, who also would be a very iconic X-Men writer as well. Number 1. Control over life and death. Would you believe me if I told you that the X-Men now have control over life and death? If you aren't up to date on the current ongoing mutants in the comics, this is what is happening in the current era. I like to refer to it as the Krakoan era. Krakoa, as in the sentient mutant island, which all mutants moved to, creating their own nation there. I know this might sound familiar with the prior existence of places like Utopia and Genosha in the comics, but this time around, it actually has been pretty different. Namely because mutants now control the ability to resurrect themselves themselves, becoming in essence immortal by using the Five, a group of 5 super gifted mutants, to create clones of fallen mutants and then using mental backup stored in Cerebro to restore not only their bodies but also the minds of those that they lost as well. Initially this was reserved for mutants who they only actually had backups for, then it was expanded with the help of the Scarlet Witch to any mutant who had basically ever existed, then it was further expanded when their secret got out to all of humanity that they were, resurrecting themselves, with them even bringing back other non-mutant heroes like Captain America during the AXE Judgment Day event. And after that they were like, well, I guess we gotta start bringing some people back, so we'll make a thing for that. Jean, you're in charge.